likely outcome is a peace of exhaustion, not a peace at all, a ceasefire. I don't think that Putin can afford to give up full peace. I think is very difficult to see. Starting with nuclear weapons would lead to really quite dangerous outcomes. Relations between Russia and the West are about as bad as they can be.
To try and decode the future trajectory of this war and also its potential implications, both strategic and economic, I'm now joined by the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times newspaper, Mr. Martin Woolf. So Martin Woolf, thank you very much for speaking with us here on Brass Tacks. Let's talk about the Ukraine war, because this has been the most consequential thing that's happened in the last year and a half. There's a lot of chatter now around a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive. There was a video that was tweeted out by their Ministry of Defense today saying it's going to be a silent counteroffensive. Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has gone around telling world leaders it's just a matter of days before this counteroffensive begins. How do you see this war playing itself out through this summer offensive?
Well, I have to stress that I'm an expert, if I'm an expert at all, on economics rather than strategy and military strategy. So I'm relying on the views of others. And I think my sense is there are very widely divergent views among strategic experts on the West on what will happen with this counteroffensive. From the possibility that the Russians have now learned enough and have dug themselves in enough and have created enough defensive artillery and soldiers to actually defeat the counteroffensive. The general rule, as I'm sure you know in military affairs, is that you need a very substantial military preponderance across all the arms if you are to win in an offensive against a well-entrenched opponent. Ukraine is obviously a smaller country with a smaller army, so there's a perfectly plausible view that despite the assistance Ukraine has got from the West with equipment, that it just won't have enough to break through and fundamentally reverse and defeat the defensive positions of the Russians. So that's one point of view. That will be very important. It would be becoming a stalemate then. Okay. The other possibility, which is the more optimistic view, is that there will be breakthroughs, that they can concentrate enough forces at strategic points, break through, overwhelm the largely unwilling Russian conscripts, and start taking back substantial amounts of the occupied territory, which Russia still clings to at this stage in the war. And I think the honest truth is, from my point of view, is that we don't know. There's considerable doubt about how it will go, but I have a feeling that towards the end of the summer, we will have a much clearer view than we now do of the future of this war militarily. Is it a stalemate, or is it going to be a fundamental defeat for Russia? It doesn't seem very likely, at least in the near future, medium future, unless we stop arming Ukraine, that Russia will be able actually to defeat Ukraine and conquer it. That seems more or less inconceivable. But the other two outcomes are still live.
So the point then is something's got to give. You have this situation where Ukraine, as things stand today, has to settle for some of its territory, which was in its control before the war began, now in Russian territory. And that is not something that is acceptable to Zelensky. On the other hand, for Russia, and particularly for Putin, what is the off-ramp that's being offered by the West, the United States and Europe, which could be acceptable to Putin to bring an end to this war?
I think that the answer to both of these questions is it's not clear. We're still, I think, at an early stage of what is likely to be a very long and complex conflict. The Ukrainians certainly haven't accepted that they can't get back their territory. If the offensive goes very well, they might be able to get a substantial part of their territory in eastern Ukraine. If they were able to do so, they could cut off Crimea from overland support, And in the long run, I think the Ukrainians hope that will allow them even to get Crimea back, though this is, of course, very, very unlikely to happen, as you suggest, in the near future. Now, from Putin's point of view, he might well take the view that not losing is winning, i.e. he will have gained a substantial part of eastern Ukraine, which he sometimes seems to indicate is his priority. Seems to have changed his views on this not infrequently, and he might take the view that that's enough. So let's suppose that you're right, that the Ukrainians do not reconquer all of the east, certainly not Crimea, but on the other hand, Russia doesn't decisively defeat Ukraine and break through. What are the outcomes? I think my view for a long time is that the most likely outcome is a peace of exhaustion, not a peace at all, a ceasefire, at least a ceasefire in which neither side accepts the outcome, but nobody wants to go on. That means that neither side accepts defeat, neither side actually is win victory. And I should point out that Korea has had a ceasefire since the early 1950s. Nothing's ever been settled. I don't know whether that would be possible. A full peace in which would create a situation which both sides are prepared to accept seems to me very, very remote at the moment. I don't know how it will be guaranteed, which would be crucial. I don't think that Putin can afford to give up in that way. I think it will be lethal for him. And I think Zelensky and the Ukrainians are determined to regain their country. And if Russian soldiers remain there, they will be very concerned it will restart. So a full peace, I think, is very difficult to see. I don't know who would guarantee it or organize it, but a ceasefire which turns into a relatively permanent state of affairs, as is the case in Georgia and in other places, seems to me relatively more plausible. Personally, I would like Ukraine to win, but that doesn't seem the most likely outcome.
One of the fears that the West has, Sir Martin Woolf, particularly the United States, its European partners, is if Putin is pushed to a corner, what could his potential response be? Could Russia, for example, resort to using tactical nuclear weapons? Is that a possibility? And you know, if that's going to happen, then how does the West counter it?
Well, it's obviously a possibility. One of my rules in life is that if you're predicting the future outcomes on the psychology of one human being, you have a terrible problem. Because a single human being, as surely all of us know, if we're adults, can do very strange things. So I don't know what Putin would do in the situation in which he is being defeated. My guess is, and it is, I think, a reasonably informed guess, that Putin is pretty cautious, ultimately. He showed it famously in the long table he sat at, so that all his colleagues were 30 yards away when he was frightened of COVID. He must be concerned that starting with nuclear weapons would lead to really quite dangerous outcomes. And I have a strong suspicion, though I can't be sure, I don't know directly, that the Chinese will be massively opposed to this move, and he really does depend on China. So my guess is that it is far more likely than not that he will not use nuclear weapons, but I'm not sure, and I don't think anybody can be sure except possibly Mr. Putin, and maybe not even himself.
I also wanted to ask you about this recent decision that happened over the weekend by Saudi Arabia to cut down on oil production. Obviously, this is going to lead to a rise in prices, and any rise in price is always going to help Russia because Russia is a big exporter of oil. What do you make of this decision by Saudi Arabia and this whole thing about, you know, the Russian economy collapsing because its oil exports have been sanctioned around the world? That hasn't quite come to pass.
Well, there are two different questions there. It's perfectly clear, and I expected it, that Russian oil will be rerouted. And countries like yours and China have got a bargain as a result. As I understand it, the oil is significantly cheaper than world prices, though you would know more about this than I do. And Russia is a forced seller. And I've discussed in previous interviews with Indian broadcasters. I think it's perfectly rational for India and China and other importers to take advantage of this opportunity. It means Russia is selling oil at a discount, but it means, as you rightly say, it continue to fund itself. I think it was probably never plausible that the West could prevent that. I never thought it was very plausible the West could prevent it. The important parts of the sanctions, from my point of view, have been that they have greatly accelerated the energy transition in Europe, which is a good thing for us. And it does seem to be making it more difficult for Russia to build high quality armaments. Because of all the imported inputs they need. So those are the two things where it's worked reasonably successfully. Now, Saudi Arabia's decision is actually really quite interesting to me. It shows, but of course we've known this periodically ever since 1973, that OPEC structures continue to work. They can take advantage of opportunities to tighten output and raise prices. The war has helped them. Russia is ineluctably part of this, quite indirectly, because of the obstacles to its imports. What interests me a little is that some of its newer allies, like China, Saudi Arabia's new allies, and I put this in quotation marks, but obviously to some extent a friendly relationship, wouldn't particularly like higher oil prices. I mean, China's a large net oil importer, as is India. So it seems to me that Saudi Arabia has to be moderately careful that it doesn't only alienate its old allies, it also alienates its new allies. So it's going to be quite cautious. But historically, Saudi Arabia always has been cautious about this, but it is always consistently supported OPEC and been prepared to make output cuts when needed to sustain prices. It's done so in the teeth of the unipolar moment of the US, and I don't find anything really thrillingly new here.
So I want to take the story forward in terms of, we've had one G20 meeting last year, which was conducted under the shadow of this war. Another one's coming up later on this year. India is the host of the G20. Do you believe that the divide that we see is not just the Western world, but we're seeing a larger divide, which has become so deep because of this war? You have the United States and Europe very much in one corner, very much against this war. And then you have a large block of countries who may be opposed to Russia's war for principled reasons, but do not want to take a public position that is inimical or against Russia.
Well, I would be very surprised if the G20 as currently constituted could produce a joint statement on the war. It's conceivable if the joint statement consisted of, we would like this war to be settled on terms agreeable to both sides, and leave it at that. Without any content. But that's been obvious ever since the war began, because clearly relations between Russia and the West are about as bad as they can be, short of actually world war. But I think a far bigger problem for the G20, since I never thought it was going to be a forum in which we could resolve the war, although it might be a useful place for discussion because all the views will be there represented. But the more difficult issue is whether on all the other issues confronting the world economy, there will be sufficient agreement to proceed in the way I think the Indian government wants to proceed. And that depends on a completely different conflict, which has nothing directly to do with Russia, namely between the West and China. And that, which is predominantly the US and China, but not entirely. And that obviously is, to my mind, a far more fundamental, and short of nuclear war, and we leave that aside, that's a far more fundamental rift in the world, and particularly in the world economy, since if you add the West to China, you've got on any way you measure it the preponderance of the world economy, and if they don't agree on how we're going to handle trade, globalization, developing country debt, international monetary affairs, and all the other things which have been central to the G20 as an economic grouping, which it is, then not much is going to happen. And there, the splits are clearly very, very deep and very, very difficult. And I think the Indian government is going to find it very, very hard to produce something that means something that brings these two sides together. On the other hand, I don't want to leave people with a sense of despair. I think India is the ideal chairman of this particular meeting at this time. It has enough weight to be so. And so if the Indians can't bring these two sides together a little, nobody can. So, and I wish the Indian government luck.
Well, one final word, Sir Martin Woolf. You've recently written a piece saying that the most consequential relationship over the next 20, 30, 40 years is going to be US and China. And of course, not just India, but other countries in this region also have problems with China. You've said that the Indo-Pacific is going to be the region to watch. How do countries like India, which are not directly involved in this relationship between US and China, but definitely have a stake in how that relationship plays out because they're affected by it, how do you see these countries, which are on the margins, sort of weigh in on this relationship? Because this, like you said, could potentially be the big confrontation, not just next year or the next 5 years, but possibly for the next few decades.
I think if you leave aside World War III, which one would like to, assume we all continue to exist, and then this is going to be the defining relationship, strategic relationship. The West and China with the US in the lead. There are some rogue things that could happen there. If Trump were re-elected, that would affect what the West means in a very profound way. And predicting what Trump would do vis-a-vis China is impossible. He probably couldn't predict it from day to day himself. So leave that aside. This is going to be the core relationship. Now, if you take India's point of view, and I think it's not so different from other let's say, mid-sized powers in the Asia-Pacific region, though, of course, it's by far the most important such country, and it's only mid-sized in economic terms, not obviously in any other terms, that what you have to hope for and do whatever you can to achieve is that there is enough strategic balance between the two to give India security. And obviously, from the security point of view for India, China is a bigger threat. I think that's pretty clear. How big a threat it is, I find difficult to judge. Or much more than this. China's intentions vis-a-vis India are really very puzzling to me and very obscure. I don't understand their behavior at all. And I know China modestly well, so I don't really understand why China is being so difficult with India. It seems to be ridiculous. But anyway, and silly. But that's obviously important. You need a close enough relationship with the other major powers to sustain your strategic interests. But you also want a peaceful environment, and no wars anywhere of a more minor kind in the Indo-Pacific region, and you need a open, buoyant, dynamic world economy. So, and that, of course, involves bringing them together. So I feel that India has two games here: a strategic game in which it tries to balance China in as amicable a way as it can to secure its own territorial integrity and independence. And that's going to be quite difficult to do, given China's rising power, not only on land, but also at sea. And it's going to become a huge maritime power. That's going to push India into quite a close relationship with the US, at the same time as maintaining a relatively open and peaceful world. And bringing the two sides together as far as is possible in economics. Now, I happen to think that's also the world's interest. So what you're trying to do is what we need to happen. But it's always the case that trying to do two somewhat contradictory things at the same time in two different dimensions of affairs, strategic and economic, involves extraordinary cleverness and agility and a measure of luck. I hope it can be pulled off because the alternatives are really bad. But it seems to me at least, clearly that's what India must be trying to do to, in the meantime, build up its own economic strength as fast and as much as it possibly can in its own interests and in the interests of wider stability in the world. I would like a more powerful India as a balancing factor in the Asia region.
All right. So Martin Woolf, for your thoughts, your perspective, and for your time for this interview to the News 18 Network. Thank you very much indeed.
That was a pleasure.